I have a complicated relationship with turn-based RPGs. At their best, they're incredibly engaging tactical puzzles. Finding the exact right combination of abilities and placement on diverse battlefields against intelligent enemies or overwhelming odds can make you feel like a strategery genius. But if a turn-based RPG isn't the absolute best, it's generally kind of boring to me. It's not like a shooting game where even a mid-quality game has a certain explosive charm. In a mid-level turn-based RPG, fights become unending slogs that I just plod through after finding a single strategy that never becomes ineffective. Or worse, we don't need a strategy at all. We just surround our enemies and beat that horse until it's well past dead. Skald Against the Black Priory is a retro-inspired turn-based CRPG published by Raw Fury and developed by Anders Lorentzen. We play as a mercenary sent to a horrible little island on a quest to rescue a woman we grew up with. I found it to be an uneven experience. There's some inspired cosmic horror storytelling that I really enjoy. If you're the kind of person who ever bought one of those $1 Lovecraft complete fiction ebooks, you'll recognize a ton of through lines from those short stories. And more, there's some pretty direct references to the King in Yellow and the Conqueror Worm going on. I think I even caught a whiff of Bradbury's The City at the very end. It's a game that's literate, dreadful, and at some points downright mean. The first half is slower and more fleshed out, with good characterization and several branching choices. But the whole second half of the story rushes out in the final 5 hours. Skill checks also fall out in the last half, and there's a lot of more noticeable typos and scene descriptions tagged as dialogue, that sort of thing. Also, the game has a lot of font options for text, which was really a relief because for some reason I was unable to read the default text they went with. Something about the drop shadow made my eyes immediately swim and unfocus. Maybe I was just taking sanity damage, I don't know. Anyways, let's start where every CRPG starts. We first need to build a character, with absolutely no concept of what the adventure ahead looks like, which classes are traps, and what skills matter. We've got a handful of classes that loosely break down as the fighter, the cleric, the wizard, and hybridizations of those. There's also a rogue and ranger archetype as standalones. Character generation is pretty standard. Pick a class, assign your stats and skills, both categories being fairly derivative of pen and paper RPGs, but then it deviates with progression. Unlike a typical D&D setting, level ups don't grant us skill or stat boosts. Each level gives us a health and mana bonus, plus 3 feat points tied to class-specific skill trees. As we fill nodes, they grant us bonuses ranging from activatable abilities, extra attacks or spellcasts per round, or flat bonuses to stats and skills. As you progress in the game, you'll be joined by 5 companions, so most early skill decisions won't be incredibly important. By the time your party is full, you'll have a pretty solid roster of skills and can choose which character handles any given out-of-combat role by clicking their portrait. It also handles armor in a fairly interesting way. Armor doesn't affect your chance to dodge, but rather imparts Soak, a stat that is basically a rolled damage reduction applied to all physical damage. It's a neat idea, but in practice it seemed to make my frontliners pretty invincible. No matter how often they got hit, it seemed like they'd roll the damage down to 1 throughout the whole game. Skald really benefits from being a shorter game. If it were an hour or 2 longer, I might not have finished it. I've started and abandoned a lot of the turn-based classics once I realized they were 100 hours long. It might be my aversion to turn-based RPGs, but there were some moments when the combat felt stalled out. There's a few factors here that can make fights turn into very static slugfests, and it's pretty much all movement related. Characters can't attack diagonally, and we don't have any long-reach melee options. Plus, passing within a tile of an enemy locks you in place, taking an additional turn to disengage. And a lot of the environments we fight in are cluttered hallways, tunnels, and narrow pathways that generally make it difficult to maneuver. There just aren't a lot of options to force enemies into advantageous tiles or slip around them, and enemies are generally very sticky. Once they pick a target, they'll just stand still and keep attacking over and over. So if you're fighting a crowd and end up with a single character holding a choke point, be prepared to skip a lot of turns from your other characters while the doorman sorts that out. It's a bit of a letdown compared to some other tactical turn-based games like Into the Breach, where maneuvering your enemies into the perfect position with pushes and pulls is a massive gameplay element. Skald also tends to fall into a resource management trap. Arrows are somewhat rare, and magic doesn't regenerate fight to fight. So once a combat encounter is halfway over, the logical choice is to stop using those limited resource abilities and just have everyone crowd around and auto-attack the last limping enemies to death. Although I guess that might just be an issue with how I play these kinds of games. There are tons of status effects, both debuffs and buffs, and honestly the only thing I needed to learn to trivialize the game was how to land backstabs. Any enemy that's flanked on both sides, stunned, or panicked is vulnerable, and any attack that is landed from a stealth character is also a backstab. It's pretty broken, and unfortunately it speeds up combat so much it seems necessary to prioritize. There are some other minor qualms I had with the game. The battlefields can be extremely cluttered and hard to read. I also had a lot of issues with the magic system. The way it lays out spells just does not make sense to me, and I spent a lot of time fumbling through the menu trying to find the spell I'm after. And there are a few high-level spells that will pretty instantly move a fight from challenging to mop up. There's a crafting system for potions and food. The whole system of cooking recipes only mattered during the first 2 hours. You'll require a certain amount of food per full rest you conduct, but each level up is also a complete restoration of a character, and you'll be leveling up about 20 times in the game. So I actually rested very infrequently and ended the game with a few hundred extra units of food. But there's also a lot to love. When the game sends a mixed composition force at you with a variety of immunities and resistances, that's when it shines. And it's a shame there's only a handful of those more intense skirmishes. I really dug the graphical style most of the time. The retro pixel art splash screens are just vague enough to let your mind fill in the horror without any fancy visual processing. And the music. Oh man, the music is such a treat. Chirping in from the early 90s, sometimes triumphant but tinged with such a sadness. The marching tunes of a victory at unimaginable costs. The writing is mostly a homage or pastiche of Lovecraft and some of his other cosmic horror and surrealist neighbors. The first half of the game has somewhat stronger character writing. It begins with our character surviving a mutiny aboard a ship, then throws us into a flashback that describes our character's relationship with his father and our mission to rescue a childhood friend. Whereas the final half tends to see our character stripped of a lot of agency. A lot of the dialogue options point to us basically being piloted by a greater will. I'd like to mention up front that this isn't a game where your choices will matter tremendously at the end. Some people will be a bit tuned out at that, but in my opinion this is a major through line of cosmic horror. The actions of humans don't necessarily matter in comparison to the whims of a god. Think of a cosmic god as a gardener walking in its field. Maybe it notices an aphid and decides to spray it with an insecticide that binds to the sodium channels of its nervous system. It spasms as every nerve desperately seeks to transmit its message across the mute and blocked channel. It's paralyzed and quickly dead in a way it could never predict, for a reason it could never understand. In cosmic horror, humans are basically just insects in that universal garden. I had written and recorded a summarization of the story, but I got a little bit carried away. Suffice it to say, I really liked the story overall, but found the ending a little bizarre until I read a lore post from the Skald RPG website that gave just a tiny bit of extra information, and then the whole thing clicked into place and resolved. I really wish that little extra bit of lore had been in-game somewhere, but you never know, maybe it was and I just missed it. That happens sometimes. Alright, let's conclude. Skald against the Black Priory interested me as a story, but lost me as a game. I enjoyed the atmosphere, the tone, and frequent allusions to classic surrealist works. There's a ton of texture and style to this game, but unfortunately the RPG aspects were a bit derivative, combat was uneven, and generally speaking, turn-based combat just doesn't appeal to me unless it's incredibly well done and consistently evolving. On the pain scale, I'd give this a moderate. The gameplay lost me a few times throughout the 16-hour run, but the story kept me powering through, and trying to bundle together all the storyline strands at the end was actually a lot of fun. Overall, I enjoyed it, but it's a hard game to recommend. If you're a fan of classic cosmic horror, retro RPGs, or just really like turn-based combat, it's definitely worth a shot. But this is the kind of game that is definitely not for everyone. I think the people who like it will really love it. Well, that's it for my 20-second review. Thanks for tuning in, and as always, see ya.